This is Nathan Lowe, one of the panelists for today's training event. I'll go ahead and get started. Hopefully Phoebe can join us in a moment. I'd like to welcome you again to today's webinar entitled Use of Incentives and Sanctions to Promote Compliance with Supervision to Reentry. This is obviously a training event that's being hosted by the American Probation and Parole Association in partnership with the Justice Center and the National Reentry Resource Center, and is made possible through funding by the Bureau of Justice Assistance. So, Sean, if you could bring up the first poll question before we get into introducing the speakers. But we'll be asking a series of 3 poll questions throughout today's webinar discussion. The first one here, if you could just take a moment while you're listening to me here and describe your current position as the question indicates, and I'll proceed in introducing the speakers. Of course, I'm Nathan Lowe. As I mentioned, I'm a research associate with APPA. I currently work on a number of grant-funded projects where I conduct research and evaluation and provide training and technical assistance to the community corrections field. Previously worked as a practitioner in adult and juvenile corrections in various roles in both residential and community settings. And then my current research primarily concentrates on really 2 areas. One, efforts to improve supervision practices through the development of an assessment tool to identify risk and criminogenic needs among chronic impaired driving offenders. And secondly, in relation to today's topic, the use of sanctions and incentives to promote compliance and accountability among those under supervision. And as far as education is concerned, I'm near completion of a PhD in sociology at the University of Kentucky. Our second presenter, my colleague Brett Garland. He's an associate professor and graduate program director in the Department of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Missouri State University. Dr. Garland received his PhD from the University of Nebraska, Omaha. He had also worked previously in the field at the Indiana Department of Corrections, where he provided pre-release services to offenders. His current research interests include offender rehabilitation and prisoner reentry, correctional staff stress, burnout, and organizational commitment, as well as public opinion on correctional issues. So let's welcome Dr. Garland. And lastly, Eric Woodall is an assistant professor of criminal justice at the University of Wyoming. He also received his PhD from the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at the University of Nebraska, Omaha. And like Brett and myself, he has over 8 years of professional experience in the corrections field, working with both juvenile and adult offenders, including 4 years and as an intensive supervision program agent. And his current research interests include alternatives to revocation for non-compliant offenders, prisoner reentry, and role issues in the criminal justice. So on behalf of all of my colleagues, we're anxious to get started in today's discussion. Well, it looks like the results are in. It looks like 1/3 of our attendees today are line officers or agents, so that's great. That's who we expected, and we're hoping to get to attend today's session. But it also looks like nearly 1/4 of attendees are in some type of managerial or administrative role. And then, of course, there's a variety of different other folks there that serve in different capacities as well. So that's great. Hopefully, I think what we'll be discussing today is going to be quite relevant to a number of different parties involved in the justice system, and particularly the community corrections supervision process. So let me talk briefly about the National Reentry Resource Center, although I'm sure most of you are familiar. It was established by the Second Chance Act and administered by the Bureau of Justice Assistance. Provides education, training, and technical assistance to states, tribes, territories, local governments, service providers, nonprofit organizations, and corrections institutions working on prisoner reentry. It is a project of the Council of State Governments Justice Center, with key project partners including the Urban Institute, the Association of State Correctional Administrators, and, as I mentioned already, APPA. Center is guided by an advisory board, which helps coordinate support and services for Second Chance Act grantees in the reentry field. Its overall mission is to advance the reentry field through knowledge transfer and dissemination and to promote evidence-based practices. In addition, here is the Center's website address on this slide you can find here. And in case you're interested in learning about its various endeavors, We, of course, always encourage you to sign up for Center's monthly newsletter and any other type of email dissemination that you may receive. I'm sure that's how most of you receive the invitation for this very webinar. And then I'd like just to mention one of the Center's most recent notable endeavors is the What Works in Reentry Clearinghouse, developed by one of our partners, the Urban Institute. It provides with easily accessible information of the research on topics related to reentry programs and practice. And if you haven't seen it and checked it out already, I encourage you to do so. Just click on the What Works tab on the Center's homepage, as you can see on this slide here. And lastly, briefly mention APPA. I'm sure most of you folks are familiar with APPA. On this slide, you'll find our website address, as well as a shot here of our home page that directs your attention to how to access information about specialized training, current projects, and our next institute, which is forthcoming, our annual training institute to be held July 28th and 31st in Baltimore. And so we certainly hope to see you there. So let me go ahead and proceed in quickly reviewing our learning objectives here today. I'll first provide you with an overview of the factors that we foresee have driven the policies and practices to enhance community supervision, particularly as they relate to the use of incentives and sanctions in community corrections. Secondly, Brett will discuss the behavioral science theory or rationale for the use of sanctions and incentives in both criminal justice and non-criminal justice settings. He will also provide a cursory review of the research literature and its related key findings with respect to the use of incentives and sanctions in community supervision. And lastly, Eric and I will discuss some broadly defined components of implementation strategy that you can use while working with folks during the reentry process, and quite frankly, among probationers and parolees in general. So looking at this slide, you can see in recent years, we have to ask the question, why has there been so much attention given to the enhancement of community supervision practices in probation and parole? And furthermore, why is there so much focus on incentives and sanctions? Well, we see there are three underlying factors that have driven policies and practices to enhance community supervision in general. Well, I presume many of you will be familiar with all three of them. The first one is the need to conserve resources, specifically costs and dead space in jails and prisons. We should all be familiar with the significant increases in corrections costs over the past 3 decades. And in effect, many state and local jurisdictions have experienced severe budgetary constraints and have been faced with challenges to reform many practices and policies across their respective criminal justice systems. One of the more prevalent changes observed has been the reallocation of resources to probation and parole, particularly around reentry, in order to reduce the number of inmates in prisons and jails. Likewise, by conserving resources, the need to uphold public safety has never been stronger. I'm sure you're familiar with research on recidivism rates across those offenders leaving state prisons. You may recall in one study, the researchers found about 2/3 returning to prison within 3 years of release, while more recent research has found that figure hovering around 40%. However, the fact remains that recidivism rates vary greatly across state and local jurisdictions, mainly because of how differently they define recidivism. Many jurisdictions have taken necessary steps to reduce recidivism rates by implementing practices that have increased compliance among those offenders under community supervision, which unsurprisingly lead to better outcomes for both offenders and probation and parole agencies. Nevertheless, there continues to be a need to continue increasing compliance and with supervision, and the appropriate use of incentives and sanctions have been found to be an effective way to do just this. And a final factor has been the implementation of evidence-based practices, or EBPs. Best defined, they are the objective, balanced, and responsible use of current research and the best available data to guide policy and practice decisions, such that outcomes for consumers are improved. In the case of community corrections, consumers include offenders, victims and survivors, communities at large, and of course other key stakeholders at the local, state, maybe even federal level, tribal levels as well. So whether it is the more widespread use of research to make informed decisions around practices and policies, or better training for line officers and other staff members, we have seen the field shift to embrace the use of EPPs over the past 20 years or so. And so with this trend, we've also seen the field experience significant legislative reforms that have addressed a wide spectrum of criminal justice issues. including enhancing supervision strategies that lead to better outcomes. For many states, such reforms have been as a result of the Justice Reinvestment Initiative, in which states have included specific policies that allow probation and parole supervision agencies to use swift and certain sanctions for certain violations, as well as provide probationers and parolees incentives to comply with the conditions, such as earned compliance credits, which may very well be available in use in your jurisdiction. In addition, the empirical support of the HOPE model, which I'm sure everybody's familiar with, has received considerable attention and gained popularity regarding its effectiveness in holding offenders accountable and promoting compliance with supervision outcomes, while also increasing public safety and creating a more cost-efficient system. These reforms truly speak to the culmination of the aforementioned factors. And so now I'll turn it over to Brett, my colleague, who will discuss the research and rationale of the use of incentives and sanctions in community supervision. Brett?
Thank you, Nathan, and welcome to everyone out there. I want to start talking about behavioral science theory. And to understand how incentives and sanctions can be useful in correctional context, it is instructive to step back and examine for a moment the theoretical basis for these techniques. These techniques are grounded in what is called behavioral science theory, which has a well-documented history in the field of psychology. And from the outset, we want to mention that we are criminologists and not behavioral psychologists, so some of the terminology that we use may differ from what other disciplines use out there. Now, more about the behavioral approach and what it means to corrections. In corrections, we deal with a population that has a lot of issues and problems. And I doubt any of you would disagree. These problems can include substance abuse, employment problems, relationship problems, problems with negative influence in the offender's lives. Our primary tool or mechanism for helping offenders address these problems is the use of supervision conditions. These conditions can be any number of things, from abstaining from drug and alcohol use, attending treatment programs, and requirements to avoid certain people or situations. The problem, however, is that parolees and probationers don't always follow these conditions. Can you imagine how easy and effective community supervision would be if the people on supervision simply followed their supervision conditions? The question then is this: why do people violate supervision conditions even when they know what the negative consequences might be? And probably most importantly, how do we improve levels of compliance? To answer these questions, we rely on a behavioral approach, which asserts that most problem behaviors develop, are maintained, and change primarily through learning. From this perspective, the violations that probation and parole officers encounter ultimately stem largely from learned or conditioned behavior. Thus, if we want to increase offender compliance, we need to understand how problem behaviors are learned and how we can help offenders learn new compliant and pro-social behaviors. As we move forward talking about how behavioral approaches can steer offender behavior, we want to emphasize that we do recognize the need to diagnose and address underlying causes of offender behavior, such as personality disorders, mental illnesses, and a host of environmental circumstances. The use of incentives and sanctions alone will not be as effective as a targeted, holistic effort to address criminogenic needs. But we will demonstrate that the use of incentives and sanctions can have a powerful, independent impact, especially toward increasing offender compliance rates during community supervision periods. And now let me talk about, on the next slide, operant conditioning. The incorporation of incentives and sanctions into supervision of parolees and probationers is based upon the principles of operant learning theory, which is a subunit of broader behavioral theory. Operant learning theory asserts that behavior is learned, and more specifically, that behavior is learned through the consequences which result from one's actions. Behaviors that result in positive or pleasurable changes will likely be continued, while those that produce negative or unpleasant changes will likely be discontinued. Understanding behavior as a product of learning implies that the behavior can be modified through the use of incentives and sanctions. In other words, the use of incentives and sanctions is a way of manipulating one's environmental consequences to achieve the desired behavior. As a result, rewarding parolees when they act in a compliant pro-social manner increases the likelihood that this behavior will continue, while punishing non-compliant antisocial behavior decreases the likelihood of the behavior being repeated. Next, I want to turn your attention to 5 key principles which are critical for understanding how to effectively apply incentives and sanctions. First, and perhaps most importantly, incentives and sanctions must be certain. Offenders need to believe that a reward or sanction will be applied when a positive or negative behavior is identified. If an offender learns that a response to a behavior will be typically overlooked, there is no reason for any change in future behavior to occur. Second, incentives and sanctions should be applied swiftly. The application of the reward or sanction needs to follow soon after the violation is identified. This is important so that an offender associates a specific response with a specific behavior. The third principle is proportionality. That is, incentives and sanctions should be proportional in magnitude to the violation committed. A parolee who has done well for the first few months of supervision and then misses an appointment with a counselor is unlikely to require extended jail time as a sanction. The effect of sanctioning can probably be accomplished, in this case, with less restrictive and less costly measures. On the other hand, a severe violation, such as getting involved in a bar fight, would likely require a greater response than a mere verbal reprimand. The fourth principle is fairness. Offenders may lose faith in the incentive and sanction philosophy and approach if they believe responses are not being handed out evenly. For example, a loss of motivation might occur if a parolee feels that others are getting greater rewards for the same behavior that he or she is demonstrating. The fifth principle is individualization. What might be viewed as rewarding or punishing to one person might not have the same effect for another. The principle of individualization necessitates learning about each individual offender's needs and preferences to the extent possible, so that appropriate responses can be matched to specific behaviors. Let's now look at the types of incentives and sanctions. Incentives and sanctions can take various forms. In some cases, they are tangible, meaning that a material object is involved. Tangible items are used much more as reinforcements than sanctions. Tangible reinforcers might include food, electronic gadgets, DVDs, or books. Another type of incentive and sanction is the use of tokens. A token is an item that can be exchanged for something of significance. Vouchers are a type of token reinforcement as they can be exchanged for things of material value. In some cases, a whole token economy system is established. Token economies list a set of behaviors which are worthy of reward and behaviors worthy of punishment. Basically, a participant receives points for good behavior and loses points for negative behaviors. When enough points are accumulated, the points can be cashed in for something a person desires. Other options include activity-based responses. An example of an activity-based reinforcer would be a parole officer approving an extended visitation period. An example of an activity-based punisher would be requiring an offender to perform community service. Finally, social reinforcers and sanctions may be used. Social reinforcers may include a parole officer writing a letter praising one's accomplishments. A social-based sanction might involve verbally expressing disapproval for a negative behavior. Social-based reinforcers and sanctions are the easiest type of response to apply and have shown some of the strongest effects on altering behavior. Now I want to take a look at the evidence in support of operant learning in dealing with problem behaviors. In the slide on the scope of incentives and sanctions, I'll quickly discuss the broad application of incentives and sanctions across disciplines. The use of incentives and sanctions is not unique to criminal justice settings. In fact, using behavioral strategies in criminal justice settings is justified in part by the wide-ranging application and success that such techniques have generated across multiple fields and disciplines in the past. Here are just a few examples of the areas where operant learning strategies have been used. In medicine, operant learning techniques have been used to increase participation in physical therapy and reduce aggressive episodes in traumatic brain injury patients. In schools, token economies have been used as an operant learning technique. Token economies have been used effectively, especially in physical education, to improve exercise times, distances walked, and somehow even pole vault height. Organizations of all types use rewards and punishers to increase employee output. Employee recognition, such as Employee of the Month awards and certificates of achievement, can be used to achieve gains in performance. In addition, merit pay increases have been used to motivate greater productivity. The closest field listed here to criminal justice is substance abuse counseling. A method of reward popular in substance abuse treatment is the use of vouchers. Studies have shown that providing illegal drug-dependent adults with incentives through vouchers, exchangeable for retail items, in response to negative drug tests, result in higher rates of treatment completion and more success staying off drugs. Now let's move into talking about how incentives and sanctions are applicable directly to criminal justice. In criminal justice settings, reinforcers and sanctions have been used in a variety of contexts. One of the best-known initiatives using reinforcements and sanctions is the drug court. Reinforcers and punishers are also used extensively in cognitive behavioral programs and therapeutic communities. Most of these programs, however, do not attempt to isolate the effects of reinforcers and punishers, which leave questions as to how much impact these techniques generate on program outcomes, considering there are usually multiple layers and components to these programs, such as the drug court. A few programs have looked specifically at the effect of incentives and sanctions in criminal justice settings. The first program listed on the slide is the Washington, D.C. Superior Court Drug Intervention Program. This program was evaluated by Harrow Enrollment in 2001. The evaluation examined the effectiveness of graduated sanctions as applied pretrial to felony drug offenders. The graduate sanction schedule used in the Washington, D.C. program included the following. For the first infraction, a person got 3 days in a jury box to see that consequences were meted out for violation and criminal offending. For the second infraction, a person got 3 days in jail. For a third infraction, 7 days in detox. And for any subsequent infractions, the person got 7 days in jail. The results of this evaluation were favorable to the use of graduated sanctions. Graduated sanctions participants were more likely to test clean for drugs than controls. Graduated sanctioning participants also were less likely than controls to be arrested during a one-year follow-up. Another program using sanctions as a mechanism for increasing positive offender behavior is the HOPE program, which Nathan referred to. HOPE stands for Hawaii Opportunity Probation with Enforcement. This program focuses on substance abusing probationers and began as a pilot program in 2004. Probationers in HOPE are immediately arrested and put before a judge for violations of probation conditions. Sanctions in the HOPE program come in the form of brief jail stays, where the typical sentence is a few days. And a graduated sanction component consists of longer jail stays with increased number of violations. The results of a 2009 evaluation of the HOPE program were encouraging. Quoting from the study, in a one-year randomized controlled trial, HOPE probationers were 55% less likely to be arrested for a new crime, 72% less likely to use drugs, 61% less likely to skip appointments with probation officers, and 53% less likely to have their probation revoked. One of the important limitations of these prior studies is that there is little, if any, use of reinforcers to encourage compliance and modify behavior. For the past several years, the state of Wyoming has integrated reinforcements and sanctions in a combined effort to increase compliance for probationers and parolees under intensive supervision, which most of you know is also called ISP. So let's take a little deeper look at this Wyoming study. In 2011, findings of a study led by Eric Woodall indicated that Wyoming had tapped into a very productive technique for gaining the compliance of this high-risk group. The researchers of the Wyoming study examined a random sample of probationers and parolees on ISP in that state from 2000 to 2003. They looked specifically at the impact of incentives and sanctions, but also took into account potential control variables. Some of these controls included offender demographics, prior felony record, type of offense committed, and prior drug use. The next slide shows specific rewards and sanctions used in the Wyoming ISP program. You can see there examples of rewards included verbal reinforcement, good time, removal from electronic monitoring, level advancement, approval of special activity, and supervision fee reduction. Examples of sanctions included verbal reprimand, written assignment, modifying curfew hours, community service, program extension, electronic monitoring, inpatient and outpatient treatment, and use of county jail time. So, the key findings of the study are reported on the next slide. The study identified that both reinforcements and sanctions had an independent effect on successful completion of ISP. That is, the more sanctions given to an offender, the more likely the offender was to succeed. Also, the more rewards given to an offender, the more likely the offender was to succeed. In addition, the researchers found that using reinforcers in greater proportions than sanctions led to substantially better outcomes. More specifically, achieving a 4-to-1 ratio of rewards to sanctions was the most ideal outcome. So let's look at a figure on the next slide which illustrates the power of increasing rewards to sanctions. Along the bottom of the figure, you will find various ratios of rewards to punishers. At the far left end, you see a 1-to-10 ratio, which means that 1 reward was given for every 10 punishers. Look up now at the percentages going up at the far left. The percentages represent the probability that an offender would complete their intensive supervision period. Go back to the 1-to-10 ratio at the bottom. What we see here is that a person who received 1 reward for every 10 sanctions had about a 7% chance of succeeding on ISP. Now let's go along the bottom a bit, to the right. We see very little change as we move from a 1-to-8 ratio to a 1-to-6 ratio to a 1-to-4 ratio. In fact, when a person receives 1 reward for every 4 punishers, the probability of success has only increased to 11%. But you can notice a trend. As the line starts to reach the point where the application of rewards and sanctions becomes more even, and rewards start to outnumber sanctions. At the 1-to-2 reward to punishment ratio, an offender has a 19% probability of success. The probability increases substantially at the 2-to-1 reward to punisher mark, where the probability of success is now 57%. And by the time a 4-to-1 ratio is reached, offenders have 71% probability of completing the program. Now I'll turn the presentation over to my colleague Eric Woodall, who will discuss issues in design and implementation.
All right. Thanks, Brett. I appreciate it. And again, I'd like to thank APPA. I'd like to thank the Council of State Governments for funding this effort and inviting Brett and I to be a part of it. As Nathan mentioned, I am a professor at the University of Wyoming. I didn't always used to be a professor. In fact, I worked in the corrections field for quite a while. I spent some time working with juveniles, but most of my time was spent working with adult offenders as a probation and parole officer. And that's really how I became interested in this issue of sanctions and incentives. In fact, for about 4 years, as Nathan mentioned, I worked as an ISP agent actually in the state of Wyoming where the research was conducted. And in that time had the opportunity to utilize the sanctions and incentives as part of my supervision strategy and really saw how effective they could be. And really thought that, and then after going back, getting my PhD and doing this research, I was able to show quantitatively that these things can be effective and can improve outcomes. What I'm going to cover, let me just kind of separate it a little bit from what Brett covered. Brett talked a lot about the theory and what the theory suggests that we should do. I also talked a lot about the research and the promising results from the research. But I want to cover a little bit more some of the practical kind of implementation issues. These are things that have arisen, in some cases firsthand, things that I dealt with as an agent in terms of applying these sanctions and rewards and some of the problems that I encountered. And then other issues that arose come from other agencies that I've worked with and talked with who have been, experimenting and using these sanctions and incentives in the supervision of probationers and parolees. The first thing that I want to cover, the first thing that I want to spend some time talking about is this 4-to-1 ratio issue. The research that Brett just went over certainly, I think, highlighted the importance of having a high incentive to sanction ratio when you're utilizing this behavioral approach. And this research certainly isn't the first to point that out. In fact, correctional researchers, well-known correctional researchers like Andrews and Bonta, Dr. Gendreau, Dr. Latessa have been advocating for this 4-to-1 ratio for quite some time. But one of the questions, or what I'm asked about a lot, is what does this really mean in practice, and how do we put this in practice in terms of supervision? In fact, one of the most common questions I'm asked is this always going to be possible? And should we always expect that we're going to be able to achieve this 4-to-1 ratio of incentives to sanctions? And the simple answer to that is no. It simply isn't always going to be possible. The main reason for that is that the giving of these sanctions incentives are going to be determined largely by the behavior of the offenders. And again, as the 33% who are line officers out there, and my guess is a lot of you are administrators or managers used to be line officers at one point, you know that for some offenders, a certain percentage of that population, they're not going to have enough positive behaviors for us to achieve that 4-to-1 ratio. But as I'll talk about here in a minute, I don't think that's always the case. Another question I'm asked a lot is, does this 4-to-1 ratio mean that I have to give 4 rewards before I can give a sanction? In fact, I've even had some jurisdictions consider putting in policy that before they can give a sanction or sanction for negative behavior, they have to give 4 rewards. That's not, at least in my mind, what that 4-to-1 ratio means. It's not, as I mentioned before, it's not always going to be achievable. So what does it mean? What I think that it means mainly is that we need to look at adjusting or shifting our focus of supervision. And let me follow that up by this statement. And I believe this to be true, and I wish we were in a setting where I could get feedback from especially the line agents out there. But from my experience, this is true, is that most offenders do the right thing more often than they do the wrong thing. Most of the time, they make it to work on time. Most of the time, they make their appointments with their parole officer. Most of the time, they don't use drugs or alcohol when they have the opportunity. The problem is, or the issue is, though, is that I think that we tend, and this was certainly the case when I was an agent, I tended to focus more on the violations and more on finding and responding to violations than I did on focusing on finding the things that they do right. Thus, I think the main point that I want to leave with you in terms of this 4-to-1 ratio issue is that if we take the time, if we put the effort in, to find those opportunities when offenders are doing the right thing. Achieving this 4-to-1 ratio will not be that difficult, at least for most of the population that we deal with. I also want to be very clear that I'm not saying in this 4-to-1 ratio and this idea of adjusting our focus of supervision, I'm not saying that we have to ignore or downplay violations. In fact, the research suggests that it's very important for us to consistently detect violations and sanction those violations. However, if we simply spend as much time looking for opportunities to reward and give incentives as we do for looking for opportunities to sanction, again, I think achieving that 4-to-1 ratio is very realistic for most of our population. The next thing I want to shift my focus to is the issue of targeted behaviors. So in addition to being asked about the 4-to-1 ratio, the second thing or the second question that I'm commonly asked is, should we focus on all behaviors or just certain behaviors? Okay. In other words, what some agencies have done, some departments have done, is put in place what I would call, I guess, an overall compliance approach. In other words, they sanction offenders for any violation of any condition of supervision, and then typically they give out rewards for general compliance, or give out incentives for general compliance. And in fact, this was a lot when I was the ISP agent. An ISP agent, we utilized the sanction incentive system. We used largely an overall general compliance approach. I think there's a couple of difficulties or issues, though, with this approach. One of those things I think to keep in mind, or the question to ask, is are all conditions of parole or probation equally as important when you think about the long-term success of the individuals on your caseload? Okay. Are all the conditions of probation equally important? And my guess is, at least my answer to that, my guess is a lot of your answer will be, is probably not. There are certain conditions for certain offenders that tend to be more important. A general compliance approach doesn't really, or an overall compliance approach doesn't really let us address kind of those conditions that are more important than others. Another issue or concern with this general compliance approach is the issue of certainty. Brett mentioned before when talking about the theory that it's important from a theoretical standpoint to consistently be able to detect behaviors and respond to those behaviors. Again, when we're talking about a traditional caseload, a parole caseload, a probation caseload, the capacity to catch all violations or to recognize all positive behavior is very unlikely. So what we would argue for, or at least what theory would suggest is possibly a better approach, is this targeted behavior approach. And that is identifying key behaviors that are specific to the individual offender, those issues that are key to their success. Now, obviously, this is going to vary among offenders. It's not going to be the same for every offender. It's going to be largely determined by their criminogenic needs and should be largely case plan driven. The things that you recognize are those things that they need to work on. The other thing that we need to recognize is that they're probably going to change over time. I think this becomes really apparent when we put it in the context of reentry. The challenges that offenders face in the first few weeks and first few months of reentry are not going to be the same issues necessarily that they're facing 6 months, a year down the road. Thus, we need to be flexible and we need to recognize when these targeted behaviors are changing or shifting. A couple of other points. Yeah.
Eric, I just wonder if this would be a good opportunity to ask attendees about one of our additional poll questions about some type of difficult behavioral change in their life, to put this in perspective and relating what we're talking about here to maybe a personal experience. So maybe Sean, could you put up the poll question with respect to difficulty of behavioral change, and then as Eric can continue talking as folks are responding to that particular question.
Thanks, Nathan. I appreciate it. So getting back to this issue of targeted behaviors, one of the other things I think is important to keep in mind, okay, or important to recognize as we're trying to identify what these targeted behaviors are, is to recognize the importance of identifying both short-term and long-term goals. It's important when we're utilizing these sanctions and incentives, and especially incentives, that offenders have early success and have the opportunity to receive some of the rewards that go along with this positive changes that they're making. A lot of times the goals that we have for offenders on our caseloads tend to be very long-term. Long-term abstinence from drugs and alcohol, long-term stable employment, long-term healthy relationships. One of the things as we're developing these targeted behaviors is to also, and those are great targeted behaviors, but we also need to focus on more short-term kinds of things that we can reward and respond to immediately. For example, if we're looking at long-term abstinence from drugs and alcohol as being a long-term goal for offenders, we might look at other kinds of short-term goals that we could attach sanctions and rewards to. Things like consistently attending treatment programs, turning in a clean urinalysis test, things like that. So we have opportunities early on to reward that positive behavior. The other thing, and I think this becomes somewhat more problematic and somewhat more difficult, relates to the issue of high detection behaviors as you're thinking about what to focus on in terms of these sanctions and incentives. As you know, when you look at probation or parole conditions, some of those conditions from the probation officer standpoint are fairly easy. Well, I wouldn't say easy, but can be monitored, can be detected. Others are more difficult. From a behavioral theory standpoint, when possible, it's best to focus on behaviors that we can detect and monitor consistently. So, for example, through consistent drug testing, we can consistently monitor drug use. It becomes a little bit more difficult. They're actually a lot more difficult when we're talking about alcohol use. Other things become even more difficult. If goals are things like attitudinal changes, those become more difficult to monitor. Friendships, we know from working with offenders that who they hang around with, their peer groups, can be very important and certainly something we'll want to change. And I'm certainly not discouraging that from being a targeted behavior. However, be realistic in the degree to which you can monitor that behavior. How can you monitor who they're hanging around with and the time that they're spending with people? Again, from a behavioral theory standpoint, the more we can focus on behaviors and target behaviors that we can monitor closely and consistently, the more effective we're going to be in promoting change.
And Eric, with respect to, on that very note, it looks like almost two-thirds of our attendees indicated that certainly words of encouragement and receipt of rewards for achieving long and short-term goals would be most helpful to them in successfully making some type of behavioral change in their life, with a little over a third of attendees indicating that both threats of punishment and sanctions, as well as words of encouragement and rewards, would be equally helpful.
They knew the right answer, it sounds like, huh, Nathan?
That's right.
All right. Absolutely. And I think that's a key thing to bring up, Nathan, is that we are really, when we talk about change, when we talk about behavioral change, the things that are the approaches that motivate us and will help us achieve changes that we want to make in our life are also going to be the same in many cases for the population that we're dealing with, offenders. The last thing I want to talk about regarding this issue of targeted behaviors is and something else that's brought up a lot is, okay, if I'm going to focus on specific behaviors, the criminogenic needs, the case plan-driven behaviors with these sanctions and rewards, what do I do with the other behaviors? For what example, what if the offender is doing well in certain areas, the areas that we've identified, but they're not doing well in other areas? Do we simply ignore that? And obviously the answer is no, we can't ignore that, especially if those behaviors are going to lead to revocation or other, negative consequences in that individual's lives. So I think that just goes back, as we see those other things, those targeted behaviors can change. And they can be expanded, and if they're doing well in one area and you start to see other problem areas arise, we certainly have to respond to them, and we certainly can't ignore them. And I'm certainly not advocating for that. And the research, I don't think, would either. Let me talk a little bit about risk. I know time-wise we got started a little bit late, so I'm going to try and make up some of that time by not spending or going in as much depth in some of these areas. And risk will be one of those areas. When talking about implementing these sanctions and rewards in supervision, it certainly creates extra work and time for the agents, the field agents. Especially a lot of them are already dealing with large caseloads and are overworked in a lot of cases. The question is, do we focus these sanction incentives on all offenders? Or do we target certain types of individuals? The research would suggest that we want to focus our attention on the high-risk individuals, based on this idea of the risk principle. The level of supervision and treatment should be equal with the offender's level of risk. Thus, we should be focusing our attention, especially if we have to choose. And we have to decide, where we're going to spend our resources, where we're going to spend our time when implementing these sanctions and incentives. We're going to be best served, the risk principle suggests, by focusing on those high-risk individuals, which is not always easy. These tend to be the population that are the most difficult to work with, that maybe personality-wise we least want to spend the most time with. But again, researchers suggest that these are the individuals that if we target, the likelihood of success is going to be much greater. We talk now about this issue of structured discretion. And Nathan, can we put in the final poll question here? Or Sean, who's ever doing that? I think this looks like the spot for maybe that final poll question. Talk a little bit about the importance of structured discretion. And this really goes back, I think, maybe more to design, so this might be targeted a little bit more towards, I guess, administrators and managers who have that influence over policy. And what I mean by structured discretion is two things. First, I think it means that supervision officers should have the discretion or the freedom to impose sanctions and reinforcements on offenders. However, it also means that this authority should not be unregulated. Rather, it needs to be constrained, and officers need to have guidance from agency policy. Why is discretion essential? And when I think about this, I compare it, for example, to taking offenders back into court or back before the parole board in some cases. Because certainly these release-granting authorities have the power to give sanctions and incentives. And we certainly could. In fact, we see that in things like drug courts and other problem-solving courts, where it's actually the judge who gives these sanctions and incentives. However, I think that becomes very problematic in a probation or parole caseload. If for no other reason than from a time standpoint. The courts are very busy. Dockets are very large, and getting people back in, especially in a timely manner, is difficult. And one of the things that we know, and Brett talked about this a little bit under the theoretical, when talking about the theory, is that swiftness matters. For reinforcements to be effective in changing behavior, they must be linked in time with that behavior. They diminish exponentially over time. meaning that the longer we wait to administer that sanction or that incentive, the less effective they're going to be. And supervision officers, line officers, they're in the best position to be able to administer those sanctions and incentives in more immediate kinds of ways. However, structure is also essential, in that we need to give agents guidance, regulation in terms of the types or the severity of sanctions incentives that they impose for specific kinds of violations. We know also from theory that potency is important, that we need to match the response to the behavior. Meaning that if we're going to, give somebody a sanction for the third violation for, turning in a positive UA, that response needs to be more severe than their first. And so we need to provide, through policy, a structure in place to guide that decision making. Also, what that structure does, by having those policies in place, it greater ensures consistency in responses, that all agents, whether it's across the state or across the county, whatever you're talking about in terms of the scope of your agency, are consistently handing down these sanctions and incentives. Right? And this isn't easy. What we've seen from some states, from some jurisdictions, are things that seem to be very successful, are things like matrices, kind of like sentencing guidelines used in court. That kind of structure based on the severity of the offense and their prior history, what that response should be. But it still gives them freedom. It still gives supervision officers that freedom to impose meaningful sanctions. And looking at the poll results, Nathan, if I'm looking at that right, most of the people we're talking about, the policy, they do already have policies in place. So about 68%, or 58%, about 60% currently have policies in place.
Yes, to reward as well as sanction.
Which is great. Let me talk a little bit, and I'm coming to the end here, so you don't have to hear me much longer. Let me talk a little bit about this issue of perceptions, because it relates back to this issue of discretion. And what I mean when I'm talking about perceptions, and I'm going to have to credit Nathan for these nice pictures. That's all his doing there. Is when we're handing down, when we're giving sanctions or we're giving incentives, we need to be aware of how offenders perceive those sanctions and incentives. We cannot assume that what is punishing for one is equally punishing for another. Nor can we assume that what is rewarding for one is equally rewarding for another. There's been some research done on this in terms of looking at, how people view certain kinds of incentives and sanctions. And we do know that there exists some kind of what we would call, generalized responses. Some kinds of reinforcers and sanctions that are most likely going to, if we're talking about reinforcements, they're going to be reinforcing to a large group of people. Studies have shown, for example, that money tends to be a generalized reinforcer. Most people view money as being an incentive. Social attention, praise, those kinds of things, or even admonishment if you're talking about giving sanctions. Those tend to be very generalized, and most people would agree that it is punishing or it is rewarding. However, when we're talking about, and really the goal in terms of giving these sanctions and incentives is to be able to specialize those to the offender. And that ability to specialize those sanctions and incentives to the offender is not always going to be easy. And one of the things it's going to require is that people take the time to get to know the people they supervise. Take that time, especially up front in the supervision. Because by understanding and knowing them better, we can get a better understanding or idea of those things that are going to be more effective when we're talking about sanctions and incentives. Another thing to keep in mind as we're talking about specializing is to make sure you consider their circumstances. When you talk about giving sanctions, for example, consider the ways it's going to affect things like their job, their family, other obligations that they have in the community. Again, what's going to be punishing for one might not be to another. The other kind of key thing to keep in mind with regards to this perception is the potential for disconnect. And I think what happens a lot when faced with giving sanctions and incentives, if we don't have a good idea about what is going to work for the particular offender, I think what a lot of people end up doing is giving sanctions and incentives based upon their own perceptions about what would be punishing or rewarding to them. And what we find through research is that a lot of times there's a disconnect. There's a disconnect between the people who give the sanctions and incentives and the people who receive them in terms of how they view them. To talk real briefly about a study I did, again, it was in the state of Wyoming, and had to do with this issue of perceptions of sanction severity. And just to give you a quick background about why I did this study, in Wyoming, where the study was done, agents had the opportunity for violations, when they detected violations, to impose jail sanctions. In fact, they could impose up to 30-day jail sanctions on offenders in response. They could also do other kinds of sanctions, community service, hours, put them on electronic monitoring, regress them in their supervision means keeping them in the program longer, putting them in a community corrections facility, which was like a halfway house type facility. They could even give things like written assignments. And so they had a lot of things at their disposal in terms of sanctioning offenders, but what managers and administrators found is that they tended to focus on jail, which was problematic from a number of ways, not the least being it was expensive, and it cost a lot of money. And so one of the things I was interested in finding out is why that was going on. And one of the things I explored were differences in perceptions among agents and offenders. And that's what the graph shows on the slide that you're looking at now. It looks at one of the results of this study. And how you can interpret this, and I won't go into the methodology at this time, we just don't have a lot of time. But how you can interpret this is basically what those numbers represent is a scaling of the alternative sanction compared to a day in jail. So we'll focus first on pages of written assignment. And the red line is the the blue line is the offender, and the red line is the agent supervisor. And so what that shows is that from the offender's perspective, one page of a written assignment was as punishing to them as spending one day in jail. From the officer and supervisor standpoint, in their mind, they had to give 1.3 pages of a written assignment to equal the punitiveness of one day in jail. Okay, so we can see even at that one, you can see the difference there between how offenders and agents perceive the severity of those sanctions. Okay, if we look at some other ones, for example, like hours of community service. Okay, in the offender's minds, about 2 hours of community service was equal to spending a day in jail. When you ask officers and supervisors that same question, their idea was about almost 6 hours, 5.7 hours of community service in their mind was equal to a day in jail. So as you can see, a pretty large disconnect there in terms of how agents and supervisors versus offenders view the severity or perceive these different kinds of sanctions. So keep those things in mind as you're looking at imposing the sanctions, or you're looking at creating sanctioning grids or incentive grids, is that it's important to consider those perceptions of the offenders. If, in fact, you want to be able to implement sanctions and incentives that are going to be meaningful. And the last thing that I want to point out, and I'm going to do this very quickly so we can move on, is that at the end of the day, in terms of these incentives and sanctions and their effectiveness, I also want to point out that this is not a mechanical process. And at the end of the day, relationships matter. That relationship between the offender and the supervision officer. In studies, especially more of the research comes from the counseling end, but we find that the stronger that relationship, that better, the higher quality of the relationship between the individual wanting to make the change and the person helping them make that change, the better the results are going to be. Now, I want to be clear, when I talk about a quality relationship, I'm not talking about friends. Okay? You're certainly not friends with the people on your caseload. What I'm talking about in a high quality, and what research shows on a high quality of relationship, okay, things like, enthusiastic in terms of helping them through their change process, okay, empathetic to them, okay, and the challenges that they face, use of humor, warmth in your interactions with the offenders, okay, all contribute to this quality relationship. But I also want to point out also firmness. Okay, so it's not just being their cheerleader, that's important, but what's also important is holding them accountable when they don't meet their goals. And with that, Nathan, I'm going to turn it back to you.
Yes, sir. Thank you so much, Eric. And I'll quickly go over a few final components that you can add to your implementation strategy. And the next one I'll talk about is the importance of engaging key stakeholders. And this is with any undertaking in community corrections, as I'm sure most of you know, and we're specifically talking about reentry, it's imperative to engage key stakeholders in the community in order to reach the most optimal level of success. I've been recently part of a local an evaluation project at a local jurisdiction in which one of the key things that they did, and they were able to find some success with respect to implementation, is getting everybody involved at the table from the outset, engaging in the process to gain feedback on how, if we impose this particular sanction, how will that affect other aspects of the system? If we pay attention to incentives in this respect, how will this be perceived, and what kind of impact it may have on the other? And part of this is also when we talk about individual stakeholders, we're really talking about those line officers. Those are the folks who are going to be doing the work. And line officers in the relationship with supervisors, and working kind of in tandem to address compliance issues, to make sure they're reinforcing the pro-social behaviors that, particularly individuals under supervision, particularly during the reentry process, are undertaking and exhibiting as part of this. So the bottom line is that all parties must have a stake in the matter, so that the supervision process is clearly understood by all parties, and that probation parole really should be at the center of engaging with the various stakeholders in the community, in the justice system, to ensure the likelihood of achieving the optimal level of success. Similarly, the organizational culture or climate of the agency is also an essential component. It really goes without saying that an agency must conduct trainings to enhance knowledge, skills, and abilities among the line officers and other staff and supervisors around the use of incentives and sanctions. For example, the traditional community supervision model includes a range of sanctions that officers may impose in response to violations. Agencies have traditionally often disregarded the need to formalize incentive options, as Eric was alluding to, even though this may run contrary to current research and evidence-based practices. Eric also mentioned the formulation and development of formalized grids or matrices to consider both incentives and sanctions as responses. These are things that can be structured in a way that allow variation by the level and frequency for both infractions and positive behaviors. An additional point with respect to this, agencies would benefit from the development of a coaching plan for use by law officers and supervisors. This is a plan that would include training on the formal response grids or matrices, as well as techniques to enhance the motivation of offenders in the community. And certainly supervisors could receive training on how to assist line officers on case management issues as it relates to the use of the responses, both sanctions and rewards. And I noticed, I began to read some of the questions posed by attendees here, and some of the questions relate to that. How do we get the officers to implement particularly the incentive options? How can we ensure that implementation is certainly taking effect, particularly among those who conducted trainings, and it's just not continued on. Well, coaching. Not only is training important, but coaching folks too. So, instilling the quality assurance piece, the fidelity piece to it, which I'll speak to in a minute, to ensure that implementation is carried out as it was designed to be is very important. And also part of this process to assess staff attitudes and perceptions. Eric also mentioned this, the importance of getting the perceptions of both the offenders as well as the officers or other staff involved about the subject of interest. And this is certainly information that maybe help facilitate or even facilitate the implementation or potentially serve as barriers to successful implementation, and agencies certainly must be cognizant of those very issues. And finally, let me briefly mention the research component as part of the implementation strategy. As I just mentioned, agencies should be cognizant of assessing program fidelity. And what we mean by fidelity is really how well a program or a particular practice is implemented as it was designed. How well is that design maintained throughout the period of implementation? This is certainly a big issue in community corrections, in which many agencies have run into significant challenges with this, and certainly research needs to, whether agencies conduct this internally or contract with researchers at universities or in other organizations to be able to come in and assess fidelity of a particular program design. Next, in regard to outcomes, as we discussed here today, and I think as both Brett and Eric summarized quite well, the current research provides strong empirical evidence to suggest that the use of swift, certain, and proportionate sanctions in response to violations among individuals under community supervision can increase compliance and deter problematic behaviors. Of course, this research also supports the use of incentives and rewards to promote compliance. And most notably, from Eric and Brett's study there in Wyoming, we found that the research is quite clear that using sanctions in conjunction with incentives can achieve the best community supervision outcomes. Nevertheless, there are areas of the research that need further investigation, and certainly your agency should consider addressing, both again internally or contracting out with other researchers. For example, the research is not conclusive on the types of sanctions that are most effective in promoting compliance, and whether these sanctions are applicable to all supervisees, regardless of risk level, cultural nuances, or convicting offenses. And with respect to incentives, the research is quite scarce on the types and approaches that prove to be most effective in promoting compliance among probationers and parolees, particularly during reentry. So the research is also quite limited on exactly how sanctions and incentives can work in tandem to improve the supervision outcomes. I mean, certainly with respect to Eric and Brett's research and then other research that have been conducted prior to their study, we certainly have some strong empirical evidence to suggest it, but we need further research, and certainly further investigations can greatly assist in addressing these voids in the literature, which certainly can have an impact upon practices and policies moving forward. So in a moment, we'll begin, taking your questions, and I see a number of questions have been posed in the box on our screen, and just also as we're on this slide, you'll see our contact information. Feel free to contact us individually by phone or email if you have any other questions, and certainly with respect to training and technical assistance, that's certainly here what we're trying to do here at APPA. Some of the training aspects that we've mentioned in technical assistance, and Brett and Eric can also assist in that capacity as well. And most notably, they can assist with research and evaluation endeavors that your agency may be taking on. I'd also like to mention that in addition to the PowerPoint slides, we have made available a handout that summarizes the content of our webinar discussion in one page. So that will also be made available either via email to you, or you can, when you access the PowerPoint slides on the National Reentry Resources website, you can access the handout as well. And within that handout, you can find links to the various studies, particularly the Wyoming Intensive Supervision Study that Brett and Eric conducted. There's an article that they published in APPA's Journal's Perspectives, and that link is provided within that handout directly. And so you can read about that study more in depth. So at this time, if Phoebe is now available, which I believe she is, I'll turn it over to her to facilitate the questions and answers.
Can you guys hear me right now?
Yes.
Oh, that's wonderful. Sorry about the technical difficulties earlier, but I was able to at least listen to the webinar, and it's been really great, so thank you so much. I'm going to jump right into the questions with the time we have left to get through as many as we can. And so, the first question that we have from the audience is related to the concept of drug treatment, and I think services generally, and how they fall into this idea of sanction versus incentive. So the question is, what are the implications of using drug treatment as a sanction? Is it really punishment, or is it more of a response that is required because of a relapse or drug-related issue? So just wanted to open that question up to the panelists and get some thoughts on that.
Phoebe, hi, this is Eric, and I guess if I understand the question right, the question is, when you're looking at the array of sanctions, can added treatment be considered a sanction? Is that correct?
Or what is the perception of calling it a sanction versus a response to a need?
Sure, absolutely I do. And going back to that perception study I did in Wyoming, that was one of the things we looked at, and it didn't show up on that graph actually, but in the perceptions of the offender, additional treatment, especially inpatient treatment, in their minds was the most punishing sanction that we could impose. In fact, in their mind, a day in inpatient treatment was equal to about 2 days in jail in their mind. So certainly I think we can utilize treatment as a sanction. Now, I know from the treatment standpoint or the treatment provider standpoint, there's probably concerns about that perception and promoting that perception in terms of, do you want offenders going into treatment, viewing it as a punishment. And I think that's certainly a valid concern and something that we want to be cognizant of. But I think also we need to be aware that whatever we call it, and we can call it something for your own good, we can call it anything we want, offenders certainly view this as a sanction, especially initially when it's first handed out. Okay? That might change over time as they're in the program, although the results of our study didn't really show that. But yeah, absolutely I do. And in fact, I think you can certainly make the argument that it's be a very effective sanction for some kinds of violations, because not only are you getting the punishment aspect, but you're also getting the treatment aspect. And if we're talking about changing behavior, now you've got, I guess a bimodal approach there. And I can turn it, if the other two, if Brett and Nathan have something to add to that, that's fine.
And I'll just add to what Eric said. This is Brett Garland, that when you have somebody who goes into a treatment program and they may perceive that as a sanction, within that treatment program, whatever it may be, we'll often have some kind of setup where there's reinforcers and punishers, so they're also getting the reinforcement effect through that sanction. So it's kind of a doubling up, I guess you might say, as I perceive it. And I'll let Eric kind of maybe comment on what I'm saying. But to me, because they're viewing it as a sanction doesn't mean that they will not respond effectively to the program, because within the program are the elements to change their behavior that includes those reinforcements and sanctions.
That actually transitions us nicely into another question we received, which came from somebody who works on the service provider side and was asking about the issue of, you know, a PO may congratulate an individual for showing up for counseling, but, you know, the therapists are looking for more active participation from the individual. So how can you promote that deeper level of participation in services through the use of incentives and sanctions on the supervising end of the...
Do you want me to take that one, Brett?
Yeah, I didn't quite understand the question.
Sure. Yeah, I think certainly you can. It's certainly going to take communication, though, between the agent and the offender, or I'm sorry, the agent and the counselor. You know, initially, as we're talking about, you know, getting people invested into treatment and things like that, you know, initially you might reward simply for showing up and just attending, but that might shift over time, and you change, you know, what you attach that reward to. Okay, so initially it's just for showing up, but then over time, showing up isn't enough on its own. Okay. And so what you do is you start then rewarding for, you know, their active participation and how well they're doing in treatment. Okay. And you get that information through communication with that treatment provider. Okay. And ultimately the goal is, and we didn't get into that, we simply didn't have the time today, ultimately what we hope in terms of utilizing these, especially these incentives, is that over time they start to realize and understand the value in the behavior itself, so we don't need to implement the rewards anymore. Okay? So when somebody's going into treatment and they become engaged and they start participating more fully, that has natural rewards to it and natural kinds of consequences that are going to be beneficial to the offender. So the goal then is over time, and I mentioned that a little bit, that things are going to change over time in terms of what we attach these sanctions and incentives to. And our ultimate goal is that, you know, we do away with what we call the extrinsic, you know, the external kinds of rewards, and that over time they begin to see the value in, you know, attending treatment and participating treatment on its own.
Yeah, this is Nathan. I'll just quickly add to that. And with respect to just, as I just mentioned a moment ago, about engaging these key stakeholders, and certainly folks in the services end are part of that process and from the outset. So if we're talking about, you know, and maintaining that process, so if we're talking about, you know, implementing a new program or a particular type of practice, you know, it's going to be imperative to engage and for the officers, for the supervising agencies to work in conjunction with the treatment providers, the other services providers, to be able to facilitate the greatest level of success, and certainly maintaining those relationships over the course and getting buy-in, ensuring that everyone clearly understands the process of how sanctions are both perceived and they'll be handled, or unfair violations, and as well as the incentives piece too. So.
Yeah, and one quick thing that I would add. Oh, go ahead.
No, please keep going.
Okay. One quick thing that I would add is we did a study here locally about offenders as they transition from the time period that they get out onto about 3 or 4 months after release. And as everyone would guess, we found that the offenders, in this case the parolees, were having the greatest challenges very early on. And that a lot of those challenges that they were dealing with a lot of psychosocial types of issues, but the money and the financial issues and housing issues right up front were some of the main concerns. But over time, those concerns drifted away. So the thing that I just want to emphasize is that we have evidence that their needs obviously change as they go through the process of reentry. Immediately, the money, financial issues, just getting established, that's a big thing. So maybe reinforcements that target those specific types of things would be most effective, but as those, as Eric was alluding, the tangible things as you go on in time, their importance seems to drift away. Obviously, they're important to the offenders in keeping employed and being financially stable and so forth, but the immediacy of the impact of not having money, not having a job, not having a housing situation, that might be a point where reinforcers focusing on the offenders doing the right things in those areas to get a job or so forth and rewarding them in some way. One thing I just mentioned real quickly, and policy may dictate it being difficult to apply this in practice, but one state I looked at, only 2% of the offenders ever got supervision fee reductions as a reinforcement. And if I could think of anything, perhaps, and this is not from this interview, but just from my view, it would seem almost that something like a supervision fee reduction, setting up some kind of scale of reinforcement early on, would be really important because that's where those financial issues affect them, is right at that point of reentry the most. So I just wanted to add that in there.
Great. Thanks. So we'll keep going for another 10 minutes or so people can stay on the line if they can. Understand if people need to pop off. We are going to be recording, so you can always come back and rewatch the recording, but keep going through a few questions while we can. We had a question from one of the participants about whether or not the studies indicate that what we see around incentives and sanctions, alternate behavior, is the same for women probationers or parolees. Are there any differences in the research for that population?
Yeah, this is Eric. I'll talk just real briefly. What I know about that is the Wyoming study that we referred to, looking at the ISP population, it actually included both males and females. And we did do some controls to see if there were differences across gender, and we didn't find anything there. So what to me would suggest, at least suggest superficially, that these are going to be effective for both groups. The other thing that I'll point out is that while we didn't see any differences in terms of the overall effectiveness of sanctions rewards, when we got to the perception piece, we did see a few differences in terms of how female offenders viewed different kinds of different sanctions, especially when compared to males. So to this point, I'm not aware of any studies that have looked specifically at the female correctional population and how they would fit into this. But I would also point out, theoretically, I don't think there's any reason to suggest that females would be any more or less motivated or affected by the use of sanctions rewards. And Brett, you might know some of this given your background working in the female correctional institution.
Yeah, I worked for 3 years as a reentry coordinator in a female institution in Indiana, and I agree with what Eric says. He makes the point that this idea, really what was being examined in that Wyoming study that I presented, was that ratio effect of rewards and sanctions, and the literature would very strongly support that, regardless of whether it's males or females, that ratio or something very close to it would hold. Now, what would probably differ, and what I'm almost certain would differ, is that there would be perhaps different reactions from males and females to the types of rewards and sanctions, which was what Eric was talking about. Specifically, females have more parenting types of issues that they deal with as they return home after imprisonment. And so reinforcers that would address those particular types of needs would be much more, the literature would definitely suggest, which would be much more important for females than for males.
Okay, great. Thanks so much. So we have a couple questions related to kind of culture change within agencies, which I'll kind of roll up and let you take on together. The first question is about, how do we advocate developing a system where the 4-to-1 ratio is implemented at a higher level, so kind of a top-down, or how do we make this into policy? So that's one question. And then secondly, how do you get more buy-in from the field, especially around agents that have been doing supervision a certain way for a long time? So kind of two-piece question: how do you implement this buy-in from the top down, but also at the line level with staff?
Well, this is Eric. I'll jump in on the buy-in from the staff. I think there's going to be in places that don't have these policies in place or just looking at putting them in place. I think there's going to be a few key things, and some of those Nathan mentioned on. I think first of all is training and an understanding of why the changes are taking place and what the motivation or the goal is in terms of the outcomes of the changes. I think in a lot of cases, agencies, not just correctional agencies, but agencies and government agencies in general, don't do a very good job at that communication. One of the things I hear a lot from agents is, well, they keep asking me to do different things and change things, but they never tell me why. And when research is done, a lot of times, I don't have access to that. And so I think that's one of the key things is training and open lines of communication. Getting them that information, showing them, why it's important to do, and to get that buy-in. I think another thing to consider that's going to be very important when you're talking about incentives and sanctions, and also more generally about evidence-based practices, is we have to realize that in a lot of cases this is going to create extra work for people. And we have to look at finding ways to address that, whether that means lowering caseloads, which I know is not always an option to do. It might also mean taking other things away. A lot of times we're good at adding things, adding duties, adding responsibilities, but we're not always good at taking things away that may not make sense anymore or don't necessarily fit in with the philosophy of the agency. So I think those two things I think are going to be key, especially early on. The last thing, and then I'll pass on to my co-presenters, is the other thing that we've heard from people who utilize these sanctions and incentives, especially after they've been doing them for a little while, is the value that they see in them, especially in terms of improving the relationship they have with the offender. I hear a lot when I talk to agents after these things become implemented is, it's nice not to always be viewed as being the bad guy. It's nice to be able to, positively reward somebody in a meaningful way for things that they do right. And so to some degree, there's kind of some I guess, self-motivating aspects to implementing these sanctions and especially incentives. That once they're up and going, they'll see that value. They'll see, how it can affect and change those relationships, and in some cases make their job, better. So with that, I'll pass it on.
Yeah, this is Nathan, and with respect to the policies question, we've certainly seen a number of states and policymakers in those states through things like the Justice Reinvestment Initiative be completely supportive of policies that pertain to allowing these types of responses, both sanctions and rewards or incentives, to take a place and giving community corrections more autonomy. So I think from a policy standpoint, we're really at a good time in the corrections field to work with, agency administrators and managers and other staff, informing policymakers, hey, here's the research to show that, this is a way it's proven to be effective. We have to come together, maybe form a work group. A number of states have done this, representing all key stakeholders across the justice system to make decisions about this particular process, and it's shown to be quite effective. Secondly, with respect to just getting staff on board, particularly those veteran staff who have been around years, one thing, a very good example that I've often given in trainings or talks is, anybody that's been a parent obviously knows about the use of in disciplining their children, and as well as reinforcing positive behaviors that children demonstrate, and how important the latter is in and outweighing the sanctions and discipline, and shaping that behavior, grooming that behavior, and certainly seeing that's a personal experience that many folks can relate to, and kind of understand that this is a process we're talking about, a supervision process. We're not going in and telling people to, as Eric mentioned, you got to give 4 incentives or 4 rewards to every one sanction. It's not that that black and white. It's more of a process. So it is about training staff, kind of reorienting their philosophy, as well as reorienting the agency philosophy to take this more of a holistic approach to addressing both problematic behaviors and shaping and rewarding pro-social behaviors as well. And that's, again, I'd just like to mention, that's certainly an aspect that, we here at APPA and the other folks in the field are currently, helping agencies to facilitate these kinds of issues in order to train staff and overcome certain barriers like this. So.
And this is Brett Garland. I'll add one quick thing because Eric and Nathan have basically said everything I could say. But one of the areas that I study in addition to prisoner reentry and rehabilitation is correctional staff issues, and I look at things like burnout and job satisfaction. And the issue of creating organizational buy-in, regardless of what type of organization you're talking about, whether it's prison, probation, anything, any type of organization, the more you get staff involved in that process, in the creation process, and the modification process, the more likely they are to be able to buy into it because they feel that they are part of the process of change and not just having change imposed upon them. So when Eric was talking about, doing the perception types of studies and why it's important to look at the perceptions of the offenders and how they view these different potential reinforcers and sanctions, but it's also equally important to look at the staff and getting the staff involved in that, and for the staff to be able to see that they're also producing the change and not just a product of change can be very, very powerful, just as a basic organizational buy-in principle.
All right, great. Thank you so much, everyone. With that, I think we'll wrap up now that we're about 12 minutes over, but thank you to our panelists for answering some of those questions. Encourage anyone who has follow-up questions that we may not have gotten to reach out to the panelists and ask those questions. And so with that, that'll conclude our webinar today. Thank you again, Nathan, Brett, and Eric, for a very informative webinar. It's been really great and informative for everyone. For our participants, after you exit the webinar, you'll see that a brief survey will appear on the screen. By answering the questions in that survey, you'll be helping the Resource Center improve on the services that we offer, so we'd greatly appreciate it if you could just take a few minutes to complete that survey. Also note that we will email a link to the recording of the presentation, as well as a link to a PDF of the PowerPoint slides that were used in the presentation, and the handout that was developed to all the participants early next week. And these links will also be made available on our website, the National Reentry Resource Center, and that's csgjusticecenter.org/NRC. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you.